I think we're nearly there. There's a general quietness appearing. Good evening, everybody. My name's Will. I'm the CEO of Brompton, and we thought it might be worthwhile somebody having a crack at putting active travel front and centre and giving us a chance to challenge, to question, to agree with our politicians about the direction of travel. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is just for a moment remember quietly for a minute the tragedy that we had in London on Friday. Those people who had their lives cut pretty short from nowhere, something that the rest of us and any of us could happen at any time. So we'll just pause for a minute before we kick off to think of that. Thank you, everybody. I'm not normally one to write things down, but I'm trying to be succinct. And so I spent a little time this afternoon trying to encapsulate how I feel about what we have behind us. So if you'll excuse me for actually reading something, and I'm reasonably illiterate, so if I get it a bit wrong, bear with me. But my observation, our observation as a company, is that in the last 50 years or so, we've created a world that really isn't making us happy. We've created an urban world where we live in small boxes called flats, where we bring up our families in an environment of fear. Fear of the air that we breathe, fear of the streets that we walk, and fear of our neighbours that we don't know. Urbanisation continues as we're drawn by the elixir of wealth. 4.2 billion of us now live in cities, and this is on the rise. Now, wealth may be growing, but our happiness, my observation anyway, is that it's not. We have mental health and physical health problems going off the scale, and with this, a growing burden on society, our NHS, that is unsustainable. But the solution is there if only we wish to see it. It's simple. We need to live more active lives in a safe environment with space for play where we can breathe clean air. We need to redesign our communities around those that live in them. The distances we move across towns and cities where most of us live are not large, yet we give up thousands of acres of precious land to allow metal boxes to rust and clutter our streets. We spend billions of our precious resources to dig even deeper holes in the ground to shuttle us, crowded and inhumane, under our glorious architecture, beautiful parks, changing seasons of the world above, or national vanity projects to save minutes of journeys in our already rushed and overstressed lives. We need to change how we live in our cities. And at Brompton, we're doing our bit and are working more broadly with architects, health experts, town planners to challenge the status quo through our campaign for movement, which you'll learn a little bit about over there. But really, we're dancing around the edges. Those that can really transform how we live our lives are here with us this evening. And I hope all of you have come here to be positive, not to win points, to exaggerate or to belittle, but to agree that we need to transform our nation to make walking, cycling and living a delight. Thank you. I forgot to say my last bit. I'm going to introduce Rachel, who's taking over from here, and now I can sit down and finish off my drink. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Schofield. I'm a BBC presenter, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. And what a setting to be in. Isn't it wonderful to actually be in the heart of an operation, to see inside the machine, as it were, as we get to grips with this whole issue of active travel. And we hear from 4 parties who have something big to say on this issue ahead of the election next week. We're really grateful to all 4 of our contributors this evening, from the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, for giving up time in we know what is a very, very busy period. I will introduce you to all 4 of them in just a moment, but first it's worth me talking you through the format of the next hour or so. So, after the introductions, what we'll do is we will invite each of our speakers to come to the lectern and speak for up to 3 minutes, laying out their party's vision for active travel, the funding commitments they want to make, the changes they want to see, the vision they have for an active travel future. I thought it rather apt that if they run over, I got a little cycle bell to cut them off in their prime, so watch out. I've got Rob's going to be giving me the signal if you run over your 3 minutes. Once they've each done their 3 minutes, it'll give you a real flavour of kind of the key policy areas. I will then delve into some of that with them. We'll sort of dig a bit deeper, we'll strap on our helmets, clip on our cycle clips and try and get to the nitty-gritty of some of it. That will be my questions, informed by some of the questions that have come in advance from people who've submitted them through the Twitter promotion and so on of this event. And then, of course, we will, when we've got about half an hour left to go, open the floor to your questions, because it's great to have people from the industry and journalists here tonight who will really know their stuff and want to ask some really kind of pertinent and, as Will said, hopefully positive questions about the opportunities as much as the challenges around this subject. So let me just tell you who is here on our panel, for those of you who haven't had a chance to say hi to the 4 people sitting with me today. So first of all, Ruth Cadbury, here on my left, is the Labour Party candidate for Brentford and Isleworth. It's a seat she took on back in 2015. She increased her majority in 2017. And until Parliament was dissolved, she was a member of the Transport Select Committee and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary cycling group. I notice you're a town planner by profession, after 25 years as a local councillor as well. Definitely, I'm sure, some views on how infrastructure and funding decisions get made both at a national and a local level, not least after the tussles over CS9 in your constituency and my home constituency in West London. When I asked Ruth how she would describe herself in terms of her cycling, she said cycling is kind of a means to an end. She might get in the car sometimes, she might get on the bus, but she's got her Brompton or her road bike, and it's about what's appropriate for the moment and where she's got to get to. Then, sitting next to Ruth, Caroline Russell also brings a national and a local point of view. She is the national spokesperson for the Green Party on transport, but also a member of the London Assembly for the Greens. You've been doing that since 2016, sitting on the Transport and the Economy Committee, and you chair the Assembly's Environment Committee. I liked the fact that you said you want to make our streets less hostile. I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about that. And when I said to Caroline, what are your cycling credentials? She said, I am an everyday cyclist, in the sense that I'm not a cyclist. Exactly. She said, I'm a person who's wearing normal clothes, riding a normal bike. I'm someone who gets on a bike rather than a cyclist. So, and she said she used to ride daily to City Hall until her bike got nicked. I think a lot of us have been there. Chris Heaton-Harris is the Conservative Party candidate for Daventry. It's a seat he's held for the last 12 years. He's, of course, hoping to retain next week. I think it's fair to say it's an archetypal safe seat, should we say, Chris? Not that we're taking anything for granted right now. good point. But of course, it is the makeup of the rest of the House, assuming Chris wins his seat, which will determine whether he continues as cycling and walking minister. You were just getting warmed up. You've been doing it for 5 months. I expect it's a role you'd like to get a bit more stuck into. And before Chris was at Westminster, he served 10 years as a member of the European Parliament for the East Midlands. So I'm hopeful you might have some insight from what people are doing in the rest of Europe around cycling and active travel. And then on the end of the line is Caroline Pidgeon. You may cut a rather lone figure on the London Assembly, I'm thinking, as currently the only Liberal Democrat member, but I'm sure you feel more than on top of things, seeing as you've been there since 2008, re-elected in 2012 and then again in 2016. And notably, Caroline has been chair or co-chair of the Transport Committee since she was first elected, looking, she says, at cycle safety, the cycle hire scheme, and encouraging active travel. So an angle there on how London is doing it and how our big cities look at these issues. She describes herself as an occasional cyclist, and I should say Chris Heaton-Harris said he is more of a fair-weather cyclist than his leader Boris Johnson. So that gives you a little flavour, I hope, of what these panellists are bringing us from their own personal point of view, as well as from their party's point of view. So without further ado, we're going to get them in alphabetical order to come to the lectern and give us a little presentation. And I'd like to invite Ruth to speak to us first.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to Brompton for hosting us. I have a long association with Brompton because before they moved here to Greenford a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, most of their life was in Brentford, the ward that I was a councillor for, and sadly we couldn't find anywhere local for the expansion, so they've moved up the road to here, but it's lovely to be back again. Thanks, Will, and all your team. Why do we want more people cycling and walking? And I think the answer is the cost of not doing so is too high. The cost to our health, to our children's health, the cost economically of local congestion, the viability of town and city centres, and of course, now much further up the agenda, the climate emergency. Now, I remember, because I did some work for Sustrans at the time, walking and cycling investments was seriously started under the Labour government of 97 to 2010, but it has been neglected a lot in the last 9 years. What we really want to do is to make cycling and walking more easier for everyday trips, easy, safe, and of course cheap. So we launched our cycling walking commitments at the weekend called Labour's Healthy Streets Programme. And what it aims to do is to double the cycle journeys taken here, particularly in England, where we have the government has direct leverage. 4 essential elements: redesign the streets to be healthy and friendly for pedestrians and people on bikes, an infrastructure that provides safe cycling free from traffic, training support, and access to bikes for those who can't afford to buy new full-cost bikes. We have a commitment to 5,000 kilometres of new cycleways across the country, universal access to affordable bikes, grants and loans for e-bikes, such as in other European countries, and really rolling out cycle training for children and adults at the level, if not higher, than is in London and some other cities. New safe walking routes to 10,000 primary schools. A step change is needed to prevent 600 deaths per year. And our commitment that I know has got a lot of excitement from people in the room, a commitment to spend £50 per person over the term of the next Parliament, which is enough to meet the targets of the cycling and walking investment strategy. And for those who don't know, the current government spend, as admitted by Chris's predecessor, is £7 per person per head. Okay, so remember, walking and cycling should become a natural choice for short journeys. And let's see cycling shifting to be for the many, not the brave.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Coming up next is number 2, Chris Heaton-Harris for the Conservative Party. Thanks, Chris.
Good evening, and thank you very much indeed for having us. Thank you, Brompton. I am not a Brompton cyclist. I know it's more of a... I was told when I was coming here that owning a Brompton is a bit like a religion, but I've been corrected by your commercial manager. I'm told you're part of a tribe, and you hunt in packs. So I won't mention the manufacturer of my very muddy fair weather bicycle associate that I use. But I just wanted to say, whilst I've been a politician for quite a long time, I did spend 11 years working nights in New Covent Garden, wholesaling fruit and veg. So I'm not a career politician. It just turned into a career. I think we're going to have a whole host of agreement tonight, because cycling is obviously good for the whole health, good for the soul, good for your physical and mental health. It's good for the environment, and it is, most of the time, fun. The Prime Minister is an avid cyclist. His transport advisor, Andrew Gilligan, is an avid cyclist. The guy I talked to in the Treasury about trying to get money out of the Treasury, Jesse Norman, is a keen cycling fan. And I am, as I said earlier, or as I was introduced, a fair weather cyclist. But I truly believe that we need to be as friendly to cyclists and walkers, people who are actually keen to help themselves live a healthier lifestyle, as we possibly can. And so the manifesto that my party is standing on offers... it's got quite a bold offer, I would say, for both adults and children. We'll fund more safe bike lanes, fill in the potholes in roads, and give children the chance to learn and to ride a bike safely by rolling out the bikeability scheme across the country. £350 million is our commitment for cycling infrastructure alone. That's £70 million a year for the next Parliament, which would be transformative. It allows communities to build proper, safe cycling lanes, giving confidence to commuters, parents, and fair weather cyclists like myself. It is true to say, and I'm going to be remorselessly positive throughout this debate, because cycling has come on a trajectory over the time. The last Labour government did start a cycling and walking investment strategy, where in 2010 it was £2.50 a person. It's increased to £7.50 a person. But we are all committed to doing a lot more. And that is because we all believe that cycling is good for the health of our nation.
Perfect. 5 seconds under. A speedy pace there. And next to the lectern, I'd like to invite Caroline Pidgeon for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Brompton for hosting this event and for your work around active travel. Brompton's is the UK's largest bike manufacturer, and a London firm I'm incredibly proud of. I think there are a few companies that have contributed so positively to the way that people travel. So thank you for the event this evening. And while at present I am Deputy Chair of the London Assembly's Transport Committee, as has been said, since 2008, I've been the chair or deputy of that. But tonight I am speaking on behalf of my party, the Liberal Democrats, so I'm sure I will move into some of our views from our cross-party committee at times. And the Liberal Democrats manifesto specifically sets out ambitious policies for increasing investment in cycling. It specifically says we would introduce a nationwide strategy to promote walking and cycling, including the creation of dedicated safe cycle lanes, increasing spending per head 5-fold to reach 10% of the transport budget. But while money is important, there are other measures that are necessary as well that we firmly support that are set out in the manifesto. We need changes in our planning process, and we need, above all else, measures to reduce car dependencies. We need far fewer four-wheeled vehicles on our roads and far more two-wheeled ones. And we need measures to make our roads safer for everyone. And that doesn't just mean reducing collisions, important though that is, but also through immediate action to tackle air pollution, through reducing diesel vehicles in particular. And a Clean Air Act is a specific Lib Dem manifesto commitment. And in terms of tackling air pollution, the Lib Dems are committed to extending ultra-low emission zones to 10 more towns and cities in England, and will ensure that all private hire vehicles and new buses licensed to operate in urban areas are ultra-low emission or zero emission vehicles by 2025. And there are other measures within the manifesto too. But cycling is far more than just a cheap form of transport or a fun pastime. Liberal Democrats recognise that it's vital to keeping people healthy and needs to be accessible to everyone. We recognise that cycling plays a key part in tackling the environmental crisis that we face. Liberal Democrats are therefore firmly committed to walking and cycling being a far higher priority. We would put it at the centre of our transport policy and not just as an afterthought, as we've seen too often in the past. So I shall leave my comments there. I look forward to our discussion and hearing your questions later. Thank you very much indeed.
And finally, let's hear from Caroline Russell for the Green Party.
Thank you. And God, it is so amazing being up here above where all these bikes get made. I sort of can't quite get over my excitement about it. I am going to talk about the Green Party manifesto now, but mainly just about what we're doing for walking and cycling, because I just want to really focus on that. So our Green Party manifesto is a full response to the climate emergency. And in terms of transport, we need a major system change to cut the car dependency in our transport system. Now, that's not just about boosting public transport, bringing in road pricing. It's about taking walking and cycling properly seriously. So how do we go about making that change? We need to make good quality conditions for walking and cycling. We need the money to make it happen. We need the commitment and leadership to push it through, and we need to stop doing bad things that don't help, like building new traffic-inducing roads and road tunnels. So under our Green New Deal, the Department for Transport would be charged with responding to the climate emergency, planning for walking and cycling as a major transport mode. So how much are we going to spend? We've put aside £25 billion across 10 years for walking and cycling. Now, we're going to prioritise schemes to make main roads, particularly where people live, less hostile. We're going to prioritise low traffic neighbourhoods. If you cut motor traffic, you get clean air, sociable places, and more walking and cycling. We'll also prioritise bike hire, particularly at railway stations, and long-term loans to get new people on bikes. And we'll have a National Vision Zero programme to reduce road danger linked to enforcement. So how are we going to actually allocate all this money? The 25 billion is 2.5 billion a year on average, but in practice, it's going to ramp up over the 10 years to 2030. We would only fund high-quality infrastructure. So we're going to need a new expert body, a bit like Cycling England, for governance and advice. Local authorities will get support to deliver effective measures to enable walking and cycling. And the bidding for funds to plan and deliver the schemes would be quarterly to allow projects to be improved and brought back on a continuous cycle of bidding. Now, some cities like London and Manchester already have an ambitious pipeline, and we would hope to accelerate them. In cities like Utrecht or Freiburg, we've seen over 50% of local journeys made on foot and by bike. We can do this here in the UK. The Green Party's Green New Deal for walking and cycling will revolutionise our transport system, ending our dependence on fossil fuels. And I just want to say one more thing. Children shouldn't be marching for the climate on Fridays. They should be able to walk and cycle for it every day.
Phone? Yes, great. Thank you. So I'm just going to switch so that I'm not looming over everybody on the lectern. So let's kind of start to dig into some of those details. I will invite questions from the floor in a minute, so do take notes and get ready to kind of leap in if you like. But first of all, let's just kind of go through and pick up some of the things that struck me first of all. Ruth Cadbury, you were talking about £7.2 billion over 5 years, £50 ahead. Pretty bold spending plans. How are you?
Hello? Okay. So that's a mixture of capital and revenue funding. The capital investment is 4.7 billion in England, because we can only cover England in this context because of the devolved nations situation. So 4.7 billion over 10 years to be paid for from Labour's Green Transformation Fund, and 2.5 billion of revenue funding over 5 years derived from a broadening of vehicle excise duty hypothecation, which would include sustainable transport systems.
Yeah, just on that point of vehicle excise duty, I think the current revenue from that is about £6.5 billion a year for 2019-20. What do you need it to be? What do you want to up it by in order to have enough cash swilling around for this?
Can I come back to you on that one?
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry. It's an important point.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty, there's a big amount of money, isn't it? And there have been
Yeah.
criticisms of the party about sort of funding models, and the
I mean,
IFS has had something to say
we
about
are
the
talking-
realistic nature.
Yeah, we are talking large amounts of money, and that's because of this, and to make sure that it stacked up, is why all these figures weren't ready for the launch of our full manifesto and came out more recently. But the point is the cost of not doing so. I mean, every pound spent invested in active travel brings in £5 return. And you've got the benefits in terms of direct NHS savings, you've got ongoing other
But that takes a while to come through.
It does take a while to come through, but if you don't invest, you don't get a return on investment.
Okay, we'll come back to some of these points, I'm sure, but I just want to kind of whiz along the line. It was Chris Heaton-Harris we heard from next from the Conservative Party. You used the word bold. Some people would say from the Conservatives, not a very generous offer. We've heard the Greens saying 2.5 billion a year, the Conservative Party saying £70 million a year. And you look at somewhere like Greater Manchester and the B network that they're planning, I think the cost for that is 1.4 billion. That's just one city.
Yeah, but we are helping them do that as well. And actually, I think it is fairly bold for central government in this way. I mean, so each of our manifestos actually has a whole host of things about planting trees. It's just my one doesn't have a money tree section to it. We've actually got to be completely realistic about the money we have coming in from the taxpayers and from road users and how we spend that. And so it's a realistic and bold pitch.
In terms of the actual spending per head, some of the commentators have said it works out at less than the current £7 a head per year on active travel that the government does at the moment, that you're going in the opposite direction.
I suppose it depends on how many heads you've got in the country, but we think it's going up.
What would you say is the amount now?
It's £7.50-ish now, and we hope to take it further up.
To?
The sky is the limit. No, it's not. I mean, but it's £70 million, so it's an extra £1 a year, essentially.
Okay. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the people like the Walking and Cycling Alliance have said they'd like to see a figure more like £17 rising to £34 in 2025. Is that unrealistic in your view?
Currently, it is unrealistic, yes. But it's an aspiration to try and get to. And if we are, I mean, we would like to, in areas of the country where it is possible, to mimic some of the things that we see across the world, not just Europe, when it comes to cycling. Someone pointed out to me earlier that in Holland, you get it's £25 a year investment into cycling per person. So it's much, much more than us.
Let me bring in Caroline Pidgeon for the Liberal Democrats. I know there'll be lots of people who are across these figures who'll want to push back on some of this. Caroline, you mentioned the planning process. Tell us a little bit about what specifically can be done to try and make it easier for cyclists and walkers.
Some of that's through the new developments that come up, making sure sustainable transport is part of that, reducing the number of parking spaces or having car-free developments. There was a site I visited last year down in Richmond that they were planning to put hundreds of parking spaces in at a cost of millions of pounds. They were, you know, a few hundred yards from a railway station. There's absolutely no need. So it's making sure through the planning process you're able to allow people to cycle, make sure there's secure cycle parking at new developments, but also at stations, but also the wider planning process. And you've seen that, you touched on CS9 earlier. You know, there's actually got to be a better relationship between regional government and local authorities to make sure we can deliver the cycling infrastructure that's needed. Because actually there's a tension there between the two, but what we're finding is some boroughs are blocking cycle infrastructure, which is so desperately needed. And
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm sure people who are familiar with CS9, for example, would say, you know, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea has become the thorn in the side of some cyclists. What would, if you were in government, what powers would you have to say, okay, we're overriding your local concerns and this is a bigger national picture?
Well, I think what you've got to start looking at in a city like London is what are the strategic roads, and actually review some of those. They were set way back when the GLA was set up back in 2000. Actually, how can Oxford Street not be a strategic road and run by City Hall, the Mayor of London? It doesn't make sense to me. So I think actually there is a lot more that can be done on some of those routes to make sure we can get the infrastructure in place so that we don't have one bit of London where we have excellent cycling infrastructure and another bit of the city due to that local borough wanting to block every opportunity that comes up. Not necessarily because they're against cycling. Sometimes I'm afraid it's politics getting in the way here. And we've got to be bigger than that. And when you look at what's happened in the continent, you look at Amsterdam and places, you know, we are way back in the 1970s compared to where they are. But it's taken political leadership across all the parties to get the structure they've got in place now.
We'll definitely take a look at the model from other countries, but just because I need to sort of be fair on the issue of money and percentage spends and so on. You've said that you would look to spend 10% of the transport budget on active travel by the end of a 5-year parliament. How much does that equal per head if we're doing like for like?
Yeah, I was calculating this earlier. I could only get, I don't know what the latest Department for Transport figure is. The last one I could find was 15.63 billion. So you're talking 1.5 billion per annum. So quite substantial money.
But you don't have a per head.
I didn't calculate it like that, but 1.5 billion per annum.
Okay, hard to compare. Like 34. Thank you for the maths.
Yeah.
Okay.
34 ahead. I think that's a pretty good number.
And are you prepared to be tough on drivers to fund that? To vehicle excise duty rise or?
I don't have with me the exact detail of how we funded, but I know our whole manifesto has gone through all the checks. And I do know within our funding, we've got our 50 billion Remain bonus, which is the funding from remaining in the European Union and the growth we would expect in the economy.
You would expect, but you can't guarantee.
But that has been checked by economists. This is not just something done on the back of a fag packet, as it were. But actually, the figures are there, and this has been checked. So I think that's very solid. By the end of a term, to be up to 1.5 billion, I'm told here that's £34 per head. I think that's pretty good indeed.
Okay. I'm conscious we must let the Green Party in. Caroline Russell, £2.5 billion a year for 10 years. That really does look like a hefty sum. And it always seems that the Green Party says they are prepared to make the polluter pay and get tough and piss off a few motorists, if we put it.
Fully support road pricing, which is a way to actually get people to pay per mile and by the emissions of their vehicle engine, which is one way to raise money. But actually, what's in our manifesto is done by borrowing. And, you know, it's a very, very good investment. Make sure that we completely change our transport system. We are facing a climate emergency. We, you know, the climate emergencies are being declared left, right, and centre at councils. Parliament has, the London Assembly has, the Mayor of London has, and that actually means we need to take the relevant action. So, yes, we're going to borrow a huge amount of money, but we are
How
going
much you're going to borrow?
I believe it's pretty much all of it's being borrowed apart from one chunk, and I'm afraid I don't have the details of that. But it creates good jobs, and that gets more people economically active, and public borrowing is low, it's cheap to borrow at the moment, and these are good things to invest in.
Well,
and we
the
shouldn't
Conservative
leave it
Party, I
behind.
think, saying that they would increase borrowing from 2.2% to 3% of GDP. I think that would be £100 billion. So if you're talking about a lot of money if you were to go even higher than that.
We are, and we own it.
Okay. And you talked about the way that the money is spent. You said that there needs to be a new structure to kind of work out how best to spend the money and make sure it really kind of works for people.
Well, when London on a good year can spend 160 million and, on cycling projects, you've got to have, and we've got TfL, we've got good structures for getting projects scoped out, designed and delivered. Across the country, it's pretty patchy. And there are some places like Manchester with the B line, which is all ready to go. I think Boris would call it an oven-ready project. But there's a huge pipeline of projects that need to be developed and designed and got ready to deliver. And we need to make sure that those are really good quality projects. We don't want to be wasting this money on, painted bike lanes on the road. We need to provide people with proper protection that allows and enables children, older people, people who feel a bit wobbly on a bike, to feel safe to make those daily journeys on foot and by bike. Because we've got to stop driving. We've got to do it to clean up our air, to reduce carbon emissions, and to make our cities, towns and villages into nicer places to live.
Okay. Do you want to whip up your...
Sorry, you did ask me about the vehicle excise duty question, and I didn't give you a proper answer. We're not ramping up vehicle excise duty in our proposals. It's about shifting an element of that income to revenue for cycling and walking.
So who loses out if you shift it?
Well, as a member of the Transport Select Committee, we look at the Department for Transport budget, and if you look at it graphically, graphical description of budget spend proportionally. Apart from rail, so it's an enormous chunk for road and a tiny chunk for cycling and walking.
So redistribution.
Redistribution. And if you think of the pounds per mile spent on a new road scheme, it's so much cheaper to spend some of that money on many more miles of safe cycling infrastructure or safe junctions to make it easier for pedestrians and cyclists to cross a major road, etc., etc.
Thanks.
So it's a much more efficient use of spend. And if you just look at that illustration behind these chairs here of 42 Bromptons in the space it takes for one car, I think that illustrates the point really well.
We're going to move on to some more general questions, and I'd like to invite in a moment one member of our audience to take us forward in time to the 13th of December. We wake up on that day. I'd like you to imagine each of your parties. Obviously, it can't happen concurrently, but imagine your party is the winning party. You're now in government, and I have a question from Paul Toohey from Cycling UK. I'm going to give him, I'm hoping someone might have a roving mic, but...
Thank you very much for that, setting the scene as we move into the future. We all have to sort of go like that. But the question, very, very simply, not too long ago, and he made it very, very clear that the government's own possible without significant increase in funding. Cycling UK, my organisation, have calculated the level needed and is calling for an increase in investment in cycling and walking to at least 5% of transport spending next year, rising to at least 10% within 5 years. So if you wake up on the 13th of December and your party leader is in residence, is this something you can commit to?
To Chris Party at the moment, and then we'll give you each a chance to answer that.
Yeah, it's not something I can commit to, but it is absolutely an aspiration, a place that we want to go. And I've had a number of conversations with the candidate Jessie Norman, who's a Treasury Minister, about how we can actually move up this gradient to get to that point within the framework that's been set for a Department of Transport budget. The facts or the figures for what we're committing to, the commitment, is the numbers I gave.
Okay, but you're not on track at the moment.
Not completely for where Paul wants to get to.
Okay, let me open that same question to Caroline Pidgeon.
I've already made it at the heart of the department rather than just the big projects. And I think the thing I've found over my 12 years dealing with transport in London is people get very excited about the big train set, the latest project. Gosh, I'm playing with, building a new railway under London or improving the existing tube system. It's very exciting and sexy. Cycling and walking hasn't been seen in that way, and we've got to change that. Lib Dems will put it absolutely at the heart of the transport department, the heart of what we do to invest in transport. And I'm fed up that transport department is seen as the Cinderella, in my view, of all the departments. It seems to not get the attention, the investment it needs, yet it's so vital for us just to live our lives and enjoy our lives.
Okay.
Absolutely, 10%.
So, Caroline Russell, on that same issue of commitment to 10% rising to 15.
Absolutely. I mean, our funding
5% rising to 10, I beg your pardon.
Is significantly more than that, and I think it works out as £42 a head if you're working it out on a per head basis. But yes, I mean, I said 2.5 billion a year, and that is what we're allocating. And it's about, as Caroline was saying, it's the importance that you put on walking and cycling, actually making sure that it is treated as a major transport mode. So rather than thinking about roads, we're thinking about walking and cycling, and actually downgrading the importance that we put on driving. It needs to be increasingly inconvenient to get around by car.
Ruth Cadbury, same question on the percentages you might be prepared to commit to.
I'm not sure what the exact percentages are, but as I said, our commitment is 4.7 billion of capital investment over 10 years and 2.5 billion of revenue funding over 5 years. And that's from the elements from the transport budget. We would like also to see other departments, particularly health, contributing, because in the long run, as you confirmed, that the health benefits are enormous. We need, DEFRA and BAYS as well. I say we're putting in big investment in terms of support for building cycling and building cycles, along with electric cars and electric and batteries and so on for vehicles. So it's a part of a whole. You can't separate off cycling and walking and divorce it from the rest of the transport infrastructure. And living in London, I know what a congested city it feels like. But particularly for sub 5 mile, sub 3 mile journeys, and what people need is the confidence to be able to do what. Because so many people think it's dangerous to cycle around outer London. So many of our towns and cities are gridlocked morning and evening with a spider's web of traffic jams. Whereas if there was space to cycle safely, or it was easier to walk between public transport and destinations, those towns, those cities would be much nicer places. And I think what Chris Boardman is doing in Greater Manchester is really revolutionary.
Let me pick up on one of the points that several people have made, which is this thing about priorities and the balance between the car driver and the cyclist. And you were saying, Caroline Russell, that it's about inconveniencing the car drivers. There was a question came in submitted online by Zach from London, who works, I think, this must be Ernst & Young, I think. Do you feel that your party still, or all parties still prioritise car drivers over cyclists? He asks, what are you doing to reduce the number of cars on the road? He's talking specifically about London, but if we talk about all towns and cities, all parties, he said, still seem to focus on improving the experience for car drivers, not cyclists. What are you going to do about this? Let's do a quick one to you first, Caroline Russell.
Well, I mean, people in cars have been prioritised, and we have got to a point where our cities are completely dominated by motor traffic. We have space taken up by cars that aren't being driven, the ones that are parked, and that's space that could be being used for bike lanes or pocket parks or just making our streets feel kind of like better places. And we have, the way zebra crossings have been taken out and replaced with traffic signal controlled pedestrian crossings, which disbenefit pedestrians. They're all about smoothing traffic flow and TfL's big traffic models to try and make the traffic flow around London more smoothly. We need to make it so that getting around on foot and by bike is the most easy, most convenient option, and it feels safe and comfortable and attractive to do it. And then we need to, yes, of course, people, if they have a car and they still want to drive it, they need to expect it is going to be less convenient to do it, because rat runs need to be closed off that run through residential areas. We need to make sure that the speed limits are slow enough so that people, if they are hit by a vehicle, are not killed or injured.
Okay, just building on that, one of the other things that's come in here, of course, is the idea of, do you just make it inconvenient or do you make it expensive to drive? And I wonder, Chris Heaton-Harris, whether one of the suggestions that comes up is, you unfreeze the fuel duty, for example.
Well, forgive me for kind of representing my constituents a tiny bit in this, but I represent a very rural constituency in the middle of the country, and the conversation we've had so far has been very, very London metropolitan city focused. I've got, there's two actually, hopefully new towns being built in my constituency, I've only got one railway station in my constituency, and with the appropriate links for people to be able to cycle. So they can cycle to the train station. However, if they want to get to the major county town, that's a cycle journey of between, well, depending on which one, let's say 12 or 14 miles. The vast majority of journeys taken by people in this country, whether they're small or long or whatever, are done by road. Whilst we should be looking to incentivize cycling where we can, we shouldn't be knocking road users, because sometimes there is no alternative for them. Now, there is a new advent coming for cycling, which is e-bikes, electric bikes, which I think is going to change how we view cycling completely in this country, and especially in constituencies, rural parts of the country like mine. And we need to look at how we can do things that incentivize people to take up these new products as they enter the market. But we've got to look at, it's completely fair, because London has got specific issues and powers to deal with the issues when it comes to congestion, clean air, and the whole lot. But you've got to take the rest of the country with you.
Yeah, and on that front, actually, let's bring in a question on this issue of sort of what's being done outside London. I take your point about some journeys maybe too long to cycle, but I think Julian Scriven from Brompton Bike Hire had a question. Julian, are you here? You can direct it at everybody, or you can choose a couple. We're just trying to sort of share them out.
Sure. I'll direct it to the general panel and let anyone leap in who feels they've got an answer to this. All the recent studies show that actually the best way to get people into cycling is to give them access to affordable cycling, and the number one way of doing that is bike hire or bike share. In fact, the latest survey showed that 43% of people who are using bike hire and bike share are actually new to cycling or returning to cycling after a long absence. This is particularly important not just in cities but in rural areas, to point to Chris's point. So I'd actually be really interested to know, beyond infrastructure, what will the parties be doing to encourage people into cycling through initiatives like bike hire and bike share?
Anyone like to jump in on that?
I'm just give it a go. So actually, the other bit I've got in my ministerial portfolio is rail, and we're trying to incentivize both enough parking for bicycles at railway stations, but places where you can actually do exactly this: hire a bicycle and take it from and to a railway station, because you need points where they can be taken outside of London, because obviously there are different. You've got the Santander bike scheme and other bike schemes are available in London as well. But yeah, it's absolutely part of the journey. I mean, innovation is going to crack this particular nut, I'm quite sure. Like park runs has introduced a whole new group of people to a different type of running. I'm absolutely convinced that cycle hire in rural locations is going to completely change, especially when e-bikes come on the scene, is going to completely change the nature of how people travel around the communities in my constituency.
I think I am London focused because I'm a London politician, but I know when I go outside the capital how different it is in other parts of the country, and how public transport has been, taken back to the bone in many places, almost like a daily bus. So I think innovations such as bike hire, such as, buses on demand and so on, might be a way to really transform some of those communities. But also, I think we've got to look at what training we can put in place, not only for children, but also for adults having the confidence to get it back on your bike, and also targeting specific groups, because with respect to our audience here, cycling is still very white, very male, very middle class, and actually, if we want to have more people cycling, we need to be working with those communities to find out what are the barriers. Some of it might be about affording a bike, but what are the barriers to get you onto a bike, to use it, to make those everyday journeys? And I think that's really important. I did want to make a point that you're talking about being too car dependent, and that's what policy is about. I've actually noticed this even in London, despite the mayor having a really good transport strategy overall. He has just approved the Silvertown Tunnel, a massive road motorway under the Thames. But equally, he's brought in a car scrappage scheme. And I said, rather than encouraging people to give up a polluting car to get another car, why can't we look at mobility credits? Why can't we be looking at loans for bikes? Why can't we be looking at credit on an Oyster card, or for a car club for the occasional time you need a car? Why can't we be being far more creative? And I think that's the sort of option that government needs to be looking at too, to get people where we can out of their cars and onto bikes.
Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, if we put everybody into different unrelated groups like car drivers, cyclists, other people, disabled people, or whatever, and treat us all separately, then of course you will have that conflict. Where we can't, even those of us who are able to afford and able to drive a car, we can't all drive everywhere, and commuters to central London obviously know that. And what you have to do is to provide easy, cheap, simple, safe choices, so that people then make the choice either for their whole lives or for some of their journeys. And only in that way will we seriously reduce traffic congestion in our towns to enable those vehicles, whether they be commercial vehicles or personal vehicles, for people who have no choice but to need a car, to allow that space for those vehicles to get around efficiently and quickly, in a sense that central London often works. And that goes from how you design new estates and new towns and villages out in the country, with no pavement, which is going on, no pavements, no obvious cycle route, even when they are linked to a railway station. They're designed by car drivers for car drivers, and yet many of them could easily be much made safe and easy for other forms of transport. Things like fares, things like, and say bike share and bike hire, and on e-bikes, which I think e-bikes have revolutionised how a lot of ordinary people travel in, say, France and Germany. They've introduced grants, €250 or €200 in France. We are proposing a £200 support for purchasing an e-bike, and by doing that in other countries, many of the people who've bought those bikes are not cyclists. They are particularly women who normally would be driving a car. They're now cycling on e-bikes and so on. And actually, a little known fact that's a good one of the Conservative government, which I only twigged fairly recently, is that in April they launched a subsidy purchase for cargo bikes. And I think 7 to 10% of goods journeys in towns and cities, in urban areas, could be done on cargo bikes, on e-bikes, e-cargo bikes. Sorry?
That was the...
And using EU funding, thank you.
Okay. Let me... I'm going to open...
It's announced on... Well, thank you for that, because I found it... I found it on the government website, so they're taking credit for it, even though you're now saying it wasn't a government initiative.
Oh, okay. Well, we can wrestle about that afterwards. I can see people are getting ready to get stuck in, so I'm going to start to invite some questions. I've got a couple of people who I know are already here, and then I'll take hands. But one of the things that so I'm standing up, I'm feeling dynamic now. One of the things that got mentioned a couple of times, which ties into this question that's coming, was the issue of design, particularly sort of segregated cycle paths and so on, and safety. And I'm hoping that Isabel Clement from Wheels for Wellbeing is here, because I know you had a question about design and accessibility, inclusivity, and so on. Please fire away.
Thank you very much. Yes, increasing numbers of people cycle non-standard cycles. So we've just talked about cargo bikes, but there are others. So that's disabled people, parents who cycle with young children, small businesses, and there are currently no mandatory accessible cycling infrastructure standards guaranteeing that a trike, a cargo cycle, or a tandem can get through. This results in barriers to active travel and forces many to use motor vehicles when they could otherwise cycle. So my question is, will you and will your party support the introduction of mandatory accessible cycling infrastructure standards?
Caroline Russell, why don't you start there, because you didn't have a go on the other one.
Yes. I mean, there's, sometimes those barriers that you find on, like little cut-through link streets, you sometimes get chicane barriers put in. And even on an ordinary bike, it's impossible to wiggle your way around them. And you see people getting stuck on cycle routes where special gates have been put in that are presumably to stop people on mopeds, but actually they just make it really difficult for anyone with a non-standard bike or even with an ordinary bike. And it's just cutting off our noses to spite our face. I mean, we just need to make sure we have decent standards so that every possible bike can get through.
Anyone else want to come in on that before we move on? Chris?
I just want to say yes.
Yeah, there seems
absolutely,
consensus on that.
And actually, when we took evidence on the London Assembly from other countries, and when we talked to places like Amsterdam, they talked about when you build segregated cycle lanes, you've got to allow the width you're talking about, but you've got to allow for people to make mistakes. And that's got to be built into it. So I think actually learning from other European cities and others who have got good infrastructure is absolutely where we've got to be. So yes.
I'm going to start taking free questions. Remember, I got one more that was put in advance, which was Roger Michael Seal from Abus, is it? Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I thought I'd ask a question which doesn't revolve around infrastructure, because everybody else is doing that. In this country, the perception and portrayal of cyclists and cycling is highly emotional, negative, almost aggressive across different platforms of media, and also within the general public. So how do we get to this situation, do you think? And how do we get out of it?
Yeah, that sort of attitude that we're sort of them against us. You kind of touched on that a bit, Ruth, saying the temptation is to put everybody like you're either a cyclist or you're a driver. Actually, you might be both. But it seems that cyclists, that Channel 5 show, isn't it? Cyclist scourge of the road, ? It doesn't sort of paint them in a great light.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, you mentioned Chiswick and the row we've been having in Chiswick, and came to a head during the council elections in 2018 over Cycleway 9, part of the London infrastructure. And, I've had a lot of anti-cycling and anti-segregated route comments, most of it based on hearsay. Thanks to my colleagues, candidates and leader of the council, who incidentally doesn't cycle, but it's going ahead, and TfL obviously, because it's TfL money, it is going ahead, and because I believe it's right, and the facts are there that suggest that, or show that, more people will start cycling, particularly children, particularly women, particularly for local journeys. It'll be good for the retail businesses in Chiswick as well. And the evidence there is in Waltham Forest, which has had an amazing transformation. And all, bar one shop, of the opposition to what was installed in Waltham Forest has drifted away, because everybody can see the benefits.
Caroline Russell.
I think just replying to the bit about how did we get here, I think we've got to a point where people are beginning to think that roads and streets are for cars rather than being for people, whether they're on foot or on bikes or travelling in a car. And so there's a kind of sense of, there is a kind of them and us that goes on. It's very, very negative. People talk about cyclists rather as kind of like this other thing, you know, like another category, and it's not a very nice category. And I think, you know, that's why I talk about people on bikes. And I think we have to not talk about drivers and cyclists. We have to talk about the person driving a car, the person riding a bike, the person crossing the road. And that kind of humanizes it. And we have to remember that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone behaves badly at times. Many people are selfish, whether they're on a bike, on foot, or in a car. But the consequences of that selfish, foolish behavior when you're at the wheel of a vehicle can be very, very much more serious than the consequences when you're riding a bike or crossing the road on foot. And so it's... We have to make sure that we break down that division, but we also have to make sure that we get away from a kind of victim-blaming culture where people who are killed and seriously injured on the road get blamed for not having high vis on in daylight, or, you know, we just have to accept everyone and make sure that that we're not blaming each other, and that partly comes down to having better designed roads and streets and less congested.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back, who I know has been waiting for a long time, because I'm now at the point where I don't know your names or where you come from, can I ask you just to introduce yourself and say your organisation or wherever you are talking from a perspective of?
Sure, thank you. My name's Donica McCarthy. I'm from Stop Killing Cyclists. Over the last decade, the government has destroyed and slashed bus services. It's increased train fares. It's given £83,000 million in fuel duty cuts to the car lobby. It's given 30,000 million for new roads. Some total of 113,000 million your government has given to the road lobby. And you have the goal to come here and tell us that 70 million is transformative. It's 1,000th of what the United Nations says we should be spending by 2025. So my question for the panel is, how many of you will commit your government to keep to stop cutting fuel duty cuts? We must stop making it cheaper for cars and make it more expensive for cars and cheaper for people doing public transport and facilitate cycling in this country. It's time to call this rubbish out. It's outrageous what you're doing here today, Mr. Harris.
Well, I think I'll start with you, Chris, but the question was to all the panel, if you can just go quickly through, so which of the parties would commit to tackling the issue of car duty and stopping that?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, because I think that money has been wisely spent across our transport network. And I'm just, if I'm lucky enough to be returned as MP and the Conservatives return to government, we're going to spend £48 billion on our rail network as well, because we want to build a sustainable rail network. This all has to be, you talked about cuts, and I'm fascinated by this discussion about cuts, because austerity in itself is not a policy. Austerity is the result of bad policies of the past. Everybody, this business that we're sat here enjoying its hospitality today, you at your home, the government has to cut its cloth, has to live within its means, and when we don't, when we borrow too much money, we end up borrowing at higher rates, and we end up having to pay it back, and I'm afraid we've had to cut our cloth. So now, I disagree with you entirely. I'm sorry, but I do. I think, I'd love to be able to commit to lots more money for just about everything. I've got a whole host of priorities, as well as cycling and walking, that I'd like to commit money to. But it's a government that's going to live within its means so this country can thrive and prosper.
Chris, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I just want to say that, as I said, more people use the road, and lots of people cannot use cycles at all. And I'm afraid I'm very happy with the policy that we've had to maintain the freeze on car duty.
Caroline Pigeon.
Yeah, I didn't notice in my manifesto anything specifically on that issue of fuel duty, but let me just throw in something that I have been campaigning on for some time, is that how red diesel is taxed. So red diesel is used on the diesel engines, on refrigeration lorries, the secondary diesel engines on those, and yet it isn't taxed in the same way. We need to be moving over to cleaner fuels, and we need to be looking at that, and that's something which is a real loophole which I've lobbied the government on. But there is an issue, there's an issue very similar in London, that the congestion charge hasn't gone up for years, which means it gets cheaper and cheaper to drive into the central zone and drive around all day, rather than having a fairer road pricing system. And I can see we will need to move in London as a city to a road pricing, and I can see nationally that is going to have to be where policy goes, because we've got to make sure that people pay for the distance that they travel and for the pollution they cause. And I think you've got to have all of the modes of transport on a far fairer and more equal playing field.
Caroline Russell, the issue of tougher taxation on car ownership.
Well, the fuel duty freezes are quite extraordinary. I mean, it is a massive gift to anyone who drives a car, and gives nothing to the many citizens who don't have access to a car. So it's a very unfair tax freeze. The Green Party wants to massively raise taxes on and duties on any fossil fuels because of the climate emergency.
Ruth Cadbury?
I mean, the fact is that there's going to be a massive problem with fuel duty revenues as more and more vehicles sold are low or zero emission, particularly with increase in electric vehicles. So there's going to have to be a fundamental think of the whole of fuel duty anyway, because it is an important tax revenue. And I think proportionally, I would agree with you, not adequate. And the rising fares on rail are to do with the broken rail market since privatisation. But we have a commitment to invest in e-vehicles, but there's no point in people replacing their fossil fuel vehicle with an e-vehicle and encouraging even more people to have their own cars if all it does is create more congestion. So we've put the figures out of what we will spend on cycling and walking in order to make active travel options much more positive choices, in order that more people either ditch their car completely or at least leave it at home for the majority of their journeys, as I do. And we need to invest in buses as well as an alternative to private vehicles for short local journeys as well.
Okay, I can see lots of hands starting to go up, which is great. The gentleman here with the stripy jumper, if you can introduce yourself and give us your question.
Hi, hello. Hi, Joe Dales from Cyclist Magazine. Today I was looking through tweets and comments from politicians from all of the main parties, and a lot of people are able to go drastically off message when it comes to active travel. I wondered if this was indicative of the attitude of parties in general, and I wanted to ask, how is an active travel message disseminated within the parties themselves? Because it seems that a lot of people are not necessarily sold on what.
Yeah, just when you say go off message, can you give us an example?
I was thinking things like maybe someone from Labour in the Lords talking about how what they call cycle lanes in London are causing greater pollution than they're reducing. Even the Greens maybe had some slightly odd suggestions that maybe wouldn't have been made by someone with more knowledge. I wondered, how...
So a lack of consistency, in sort of policy and approach, perhaps. Does anyone have any thoughts to share on how policy is sort of then disseminated and you make sure everyone's signed up to it? Caroline Russell.
I think that's a really good question. There's no way that everyone involved in a political party is going to be an expert on the finer details of how walking and cycling policy is worked out. And sometimes this stuff can get very heated. It can get very contentious, particularly with things that are counterintuitive. So if you've got people wanting to filter side roads, and then people get worried about what's going to happen to the people living on the main roads. And it is counterintuitive that by closing off the side roads to traffic, you might actually get an overall reduction in traffic. And you need to make sure that you engage communities, really affect it. You know, these are hard conversations to have. And absolutely, in every political party, there are going to be people who find themselves in a situation where they're talking about a contentious local scheme and they don't have the full background in, you know, all the finer points of active travel and active travel theory. And people will say things that don't add up. And I think the important thing is to try to get across to everyone, you know, what your party's policies are.
Chris Heaton-Hill.
Yeah, it's just a point that I don't think
Harris,
anybody... You can call me what you like. I don't think anybody on this panel got into politics just to repeat what our party leader might be saying on policy at any given time. We all got into politics to change things. And people join political parties, yes, because they subscribe to the broad themes of the principles behind, I don't know, the economic theory and others. But actually on individual policies, there's massive debate in each of the parties, and I think that's healthy, not a bad thing.
I know there's lots of hands up. The gentleman with the orange lanyard there. Yes. So tell us who you are, first of all. There's a microphone coming to you, just so we make sure everybody can hear.
Hello, Philip Benstead. I live in Westminster. I'm an independent cycle campaigner. Everyone keeps talking about facilities and about this and that, but the trouble is, I think it was Mayor Ilya talked about hyperactivity, hyper-travel. The trouble is everyone's travelling around. Good example is Crossrail. Costs billions to build when it's actually opened. That means somebody could live in Shenfield and work in Reading. Well, that's a stupid journey to take every day. And what are the parties going to do about planning so that people do not have to travel so far? For example, out of town supermarkets, for example, that encourages people to travel a long way. It's the planning process that encourages people to travel unnecessary. What are you going to do about it?
Anyone like to come in on that? Ruth Cadbury.
Well, I mean, obviously our active travel policies have got to be, as I already said, incorporated into planning policies. I mean, I remember towards the end of the Labour government, we launched green cities, green towns, linked to rail stations, and were aiming towards zero emissions. But and that all went out the door with the change of government. Sorry, the gist of your question, it was planning and... sorry. I mean, the other thing is the world is changing. We are changing our shopping habits. So to some extent, public policy has got to react to quite drastic changes in things like our shopping, the retail experience, and also working practices are changing massively. I've been elected 4.5 years. My staff, because of the changes in IT and IT security, my staff can work 2 or 3 days a week from home and not even need to commute. So, and one of our proposals is that rail fares, season tickets, reflect the need of people who only commute 2 or 3 days a week and not 5 days a week. So travel is changing, and government and policy has to catch up with that.
I know there'll be other people who want to comment on that, but I can see so many hands. I want to get through as many as possible. I haven't taken from this side of the room. Yes, the lady here in the front row. Wait for the microphone's here. Do tell us, introduce yourself and give us your question. I'm going to ask as well the panel, if you want to come in, give me a signal and try and keep it short and snappy if you can. Yes.
So cycling is kind of unique, or cycling and walking, I should say, in that unlike other transport modes, it doesn't have long-term strategic planning and funding. It tends to come in 4 or 5 year parliamentary cycles, after which councils have to get rid of staff, they lose all their expertise, they lose all their plans, and when funding comes back around again, they have to start from scratch. So something needs to fundamentally change if we're going to increase cycling. What would you do to ensure it's embedded in Parliament?
So proper continuity of policy, so the security of funding, councils can plan and so on. Yes, Caroline Russell.
Yes, what I hope I was talking about at the beginning was the idea of a constant cycle of bidding so that local authorities, transport authorities could bid for money from the £2.5 billion a year pot. And the bidding cycle would be every 3 months. So that if a scheme wasn't good enough, it could go away, be sent back for a bit more work, more advice, more guidance, and then it could come back into the next bidding cycle 3 months later and hopefully get the funding. And that is meant to try to find a way to actually develop good schemes and to provide the support for local authorities to be able to come up with good schemes and schemes that work.
Okay, I'm going to keep us moving. Stay on the front row, gentleman with the glasses, who I think is... No, you're not Brompton.
I work with Brompton, but I'm speaking on behalf of my rural constituency of which I reside, which is Kenilworth in Warwickshire. And a lot of noise from the major parties is around electric vehicles, which doesn't take into consideration the road space that cars take up and how it's not fairly allocated towards pedestrians, cyclists and other modes of transport. It always occurs to me that an e-traffic jam is still a traffic jam. And 68% of car journeys are under 5 miles, 24% of car journeys are under 1 mile. So how do we make driving more difficult, because it's a really politically sensitive issue, and how do we stop the hacking of the system, i.e. you can buy a big Range Rover nowadays and pay £225 tax on it a year because it is so eco-friendly, but it's doing so much damage to our towns and cities?
Who'd like to come in on that? Yes,
I think
Caroline Pigeon.
I think in cities it's a lot easier for people to give up cars because if they've got the occasional journey that they want to use a car for, you can have car clubs now. And I see more and more of the next generation of people not owning a car, not even thinking about owning a car, but they want, I don't know, to go to IKEA one weekend. They can use a zip van and so on. And I see that as the model going forward in cities. I think it's far harder in rural areas and the infrastructure isn't there necessarily for that. And I can't really speak for those areas and the ones where you live, but I do see car ownership absolutely falling, certainly in central and inner London, and hopefully with more investment out of London too.
We're tight on time. I'm going to take 2 more questions, and I'm just going to give the candidates a heads up that when we've done that, I'll give you each just a minute to kind of give a sense of what you're learning, what you've learned, what you're thinking going forward, any comments on this evening's proceedings. But yes, did I ask you already? No. Gentlemen, did you already ask a question? No, sorry.
Hello, I'm Philip Darnton. I'm the chair of the Bicycle Association, and I was the chair of Cycling England for as long as it lasted. There's been a lot of talk about funding, and I actually think that although we spent a lot of time on it, it misses the point. The issue, which was touched on a minute ago, seems to me about continuity and consistency. And it also seems to me that everybody started off by saying that they would probably all agree, and a lot of the things you've said you do agree about. But one of the things that doesn't happen is that every single change of administration, everything stops and starts again, has been made just clear just now. That isn't the same in road or rail. There's a road investment strategy, there's a rail investment strategy. It lasts over many years, up to 20 years, and I wonder we all agree together, have a cycling investment strategy that sorts out whoever is actually in power making marginal changes, that the strategy is something that has leadership and political will that doesn't change from one administration to another.
Yeah, Chris Heaton-Harris.
Yeah, actually I was going to try and leap back to the point that Laura made at the front on in my minute, but so actually, rail is a 5-year plan. It's control periods for 5 years, and there is this. I have to say, a general election can change an administration, which can change priorities completely. So you are always going to have points where there is potential for change. However, having read the others' manifestos as well, I think everybody is in agreement that we need a strategy, as you describe, going forward. But there are those caveats that when a new wind blows through the town, there could be complete change. And yes, we do need to make sure that the central government gives the confidence to local government that it can plan across a longer period of time, which it hasn't done in the last few years.
Okay, time for one more. Oh gosh, who feels they've got one that's going to really kind of bring us to a nice mood? The gentleman at the back, he's been trying to catch my eye for ages. You better be a good one. Oh, I'm sorry. It's to balance the panel, you see.
Hello. I'm representing Stop Killing Cyclists and also, in this case, parents. I spent 3 years campaigning to get the the road outside my daughter's school in Tower Hamlets changed to one way. I faced down violent threats from other parents. There are a minority of people that drive to schools that cause an awful lot of road violence. We saw yesterday there was a 12-year-old killed in Essex by a driver. There was parents driving into families on the pavement in Tower Hamlets. We also know that a lot of congestion is caused by people driving to school. 25% of congestion is parents driving to school. And we also know that kids, if they form a good habit at school, they can retain that habit for life. So how are you going to make it more easy and safe for children to travel to school using active transport?
Good question about the younger generation looking forwards. Who'd like to take that? Caroline Russell?
I made the decision to get into politics after a child was killed walking to school, on the walk to school one morning down the road from where I live. She was 4 years old and her buggy went under the wheels of a heavy goods vehicle. She would be 21 if she was still alive now. And I just thought we have to change our transport policies to make it so that nobody gets killed or seriously injured on our roads. We can do it. We can do it with Vision Zero, but we need to make changes. We need to curb the freedom to drive as fast as we like or as carelessly as we like. But we absolutely have to reduce the numbers of people who are being killed and seriously injured on our roads. There are so many things, positive things we can do. Play streets, school streets. These are all community-led, bottom-up activities that are beginning to change the way and people's perception of what our streets are for. And it's getting to that point where people think of our streets as being for people and not just for motorised traffic.
Okay, thank you. We are going to bring things to a close. I will invite the candidates just to give us a little summary of their thoughts, preferably not just a reiteration of your policies, but something that moves us forward, that takes us away with some thoughts to consider. We will go pretty much in reverse order from before. So let me invite you, Caroline Russell, to just give us a minute. Pithy, thought-provoking stuff, please.
We can change things. We can get to a point where 50% of journeys are made by walking and cycling. We can clean up our air. We can reduce carbon emissions. And the Green Party's Green New Deal has a plan for how we can actually do that. So when you're voting on the 12th of December, I hope you will pause and think, if not now, when? Vote Green.
Okay, thank you. Caroline Pidgeon next, please.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, at this election, the Liberal Democrats have a clear plan for how we will build a brighter future. And the first step of our plan is to stop Brexit and to use the Remain bonus to invest in public transport and public services, including transport. We are absolutely committed to prioritising walking and cycling and ensuring a better integration of rail, bus and cycle routes, something we've been discussing this evening, and getting people out of cars and using more sustainable transport. We will legislate for the right to have unpolluted air and take urgent action to reduce pollution, particularly from traffic. So what's not to like? You know, a vote for the Lib Dems is a vote for a brighter and a more sustainable future. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Ruth Cadbury for the Labour. Ruth Cadbury. Oh, no, the other way around. Sorry, Chris Heaton-Harris.
Firstly, again, thank you very much indeed to Brompton for hosting this. I hope it was what you wanted it to be. Secondly, you wanted something pithy and thought-provoking, and I just wanted to follow on from the gentleman's question about what his experience in Tower Hamlets, because I promise you that that happens across the country, whether it be rural or city. And I think we need to change the confidence of parents so to try and make them more confident in allowing their child to walk or cycle to school. Now, I think we're all committed to the bikeability scheme. So the old cycling proficiency, as I would know it, being extended from half the kids in the country getting it currently to the whole of a school intake. I think that is one way. You don't just encourage children to feel more confident about their ability to cycle, but you encourage their parents because they feel safe that their children can do so in a safe way. And that's something I think we can all agree on and push for.
Thank you. And Ruth, finally.
The reason the Conservatives say they are not spending the money that goes with their ambition for the cycling and walking investment strategy is austerity. But we know that austerity was a deliberate choice to cut the public sector, whereas equivalent countries invested in the public sector after the 2007-8 crash. So that's a redundant argument. We are committed, as you saw in the launch this weekend, we are committed changes that go along with it, significant investment to have a revolutionary change on how we do our day-to-day journeys and our short journeys and our local journeys and our journeys between home and public transport or work and public transport. If the Netherlands could do it in the 70s,
10 seconds.
Then the UK can do it in the 2020s.
Thank you very much. Indeed. That brings us to an end of our proceedings this evening. It only remains me to say a massive thank you to our 4 panellists this evening, to Caroline Pidgeon, Chris Heaton-Harris, who I'm sure you'll agree have given up their evening to come and answer your questions. I know there were lots of you who had questions you still wanted to ask. Please stay around. I'm hoping the 4 of our contributors here have got time. If they have, grab them with your question and let's take this discussion forward and keep talking, because the feeling seems to be that if we're going to change, we need to find ways to agree and we need to find consensus. So thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you to Brompton.